So James, we're trying to figure out what is the readiness goal this week. And you said be explicit about an implicit standard. And I'm worried that if people go around stating what they think the implicit standard is as if it's God's given truth, that's going to get them in even hotter water. Like if I said to you, hey, James, the standard we're moving toward here is absolute clarity on our readiness goal, right? And you're like, no, we want a more nuanced take on that. And I'm like, no, that's the standard. And then you might be like, F you, Rudolph, that's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Jenny. So the issue is that we want people to recognize that when you think to yourself, the implicit standard in our organization or our unit or our team is X, Y, and Z, that is your perspective on what the standard is. Or when the handbook says that, that is the handbook's perspective on what the standard is. That does not necessarily reflect the mutually constructed standard that exists as meaning between different people and the work as it is done.
Right.
That is a very nuanced take on it that may be too complicated.
Yeah. Okay. So we don't have to solve the postmodern, post-constructionist world view at this moment.
We don't. I wish you would have told me that when I was in grad school.
Okay. So what if we say the readiness goal for this episode is to detect and make a possibly implicit standard explicit by stating it aloud? The caution we offer along with that is to say, it's my perspective that that is the standard. And I guess, James, that could be our workout of the week. We could do that at the end.
Yeah, say out loud. My perspective is that this is the
Yes.
standard.
Okay.
Well,
So
you've just come to it very cleanly. Yes, that's
there
it.
we go.
That's the one.
Okay.
Perfect.
James, can you tell that story that you heard?
Oh yeah, I was in the blood drawing station of ER, which happened to be set up at the end of a hallway in a maintenance closet, because that's how ERs are these days. Therefore, I could really hear a lot of conversations that were happening amongst the staff. And a young male nurse who was clearly new was talking with an older female nurse who was clearly very experienced in that unit about getting some blood draws from a patient. And he mentioned that they had an IV that wasn't hooked up to anything and he could draw some blood through that. And she sort of looked at him and went, "No one does that here."
Okay, so that's a great example of a implicit standard, which is I'm saying no one does that here. And that indicates or hints that the standard is we draw blood from a different port or we place a new IV or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so summarizing, the readiness goal for this episode is to name an implicit standard explicitly.
And on that
Okay.
note, Jenny, there is a very fat dog running through my front yard unaccompanied that we
Okay.
can take our pause for me to go check on.
Welcome back to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. I'm Jenny Rudolph. Today, we're going to be diving into the slightly nerdly topic of standards. So this week, behind everything we're talking about is a new standard that I and some members of my team, Clément Bouillon, Damien Shield, and some others have created called the AIR, the Advocacy Inquiry Rubric, which is a way of being explicit about how do you do a good preview, how do you say a strong observation, how do you share your point of view, how do you ask an open-ended inquiry, and then how do you listen? And so the AIR gives us a standard on how to do those things. So I've spent more than 15 years kind of obsessed with advocacy inquiry. And people sometimes ask me, like, why do you care about this so much? Like, what's up with that, Jenny? And I realized that if I'm completely honest, it is personal. I hate being manipulated. I really dislike it when somebody I really care about or someone has formal power over me has something in mind and doesn't share it. And there's something in the air that is kind of pushing me towards something, or they're asking something of me, but I don't know what it is. I dislike the feeling of being out of control. I dislike the feeling of somehow being made to do something and I don't know what it is. I realized over the years that, as one of my therapists said, research is me search, Jenny, that my quest to try to get myself and other people to be open and honest and disclose their judgments and share where they're coming from and share their intent had something to do with a psychological need of mine. When I dug into it a little further, I realized like I have this inner sentry, like she's on a little parapet at the edge of the fortress of my life. And I also have kind of an inner rebel. And when I feel manipulated or I feel like people are being indirect, those characters kind of jump up like with their little swords and, try to back people off or, give me a way to protect myself from that. And so I think, like any good creative person or researcher who kind of streams that motivation into their work, I realize I've come to really care about how do we create psychologically safe environments where we can be open. And so preview, advocacy, inquiry has really been part of that for me. After our conversation and struggle, I think James and I landed on the idea that the readiness goal for this episode is, how do you name an implicit standard explicitly? So in those situations where you feel like somebody's driving toward something they want you to do differently, or you yourself have this uncomfortable feeling like, I have a standard that has not been met here and I'm upset about it, or the team is struggling to get clarity on what is our standard here. That's really what we're going to be focusing on. How do we have collective standards together? I think that part of why I like formal rubrics is that I learned early in my research career that vagueness on this can literally be life-threatening. And that came about in my studies of nuclear power plant accidents. And what happened over and over is that people disagreed on what was actually the right standard for running the nuclear power plant at that moment. Some small things like gauge positions, recordings, unspoken rules of practice all came to play usually when there was some sort of error or accident. And disagreements about what counted as good practice got in people's way of working collectively to have a nuclear power plant that was safe and kept the people within it safe. So drawing on that and my doctoral research on diagnostic problem solving in the OR, I realized that sometimes when you disagree about what's happening with a patient, or you disagree about what's happening in a meeting, those disagreements seem really mysterious, like the roots of them cannot be found, and that escalates the conflict. When people don't know what they're arguing about, that adds to their cognitive load and frustration, and emotions escalate even faster. Distrust creeps in. All these different not good things happen when we don't know what the standard at play is. So what I've found as we get more explicit about preview, I think, I wonder, listen, for example, as a standard, and helping people get better at feedback conversations or debriefing conversations, is if I can coach you on what is a good preview and you understand what I'm coaching you toward, friction between us drops as, we're both moving toward the same thing. The accuracy of what you're trying to master increases. And when we have disagreements, instead of them being very vague and threatening of the relationship, we can state aloud, what is the criteria? What are the criteria we're moving towards? So for example, a concrete observation, as we worked on a couple weeks ago, names the who, what, where, and why of what's happening so that anybody can see it and know what that observation is as well. a really important thing about shared standards or explicit standards is it lets us work together better. It allows us to form a community of practice where we're all moving up the learning curve together at how do I create a good preview, for example, where you know the topic I'm talking about, you know the moment I'm talking about, you know my intentions in the next bit of the conversation, and you don't have to guess. That allows you to work better with me or the rest of the team to work better with me to get things done. So I want to pivot now and talk a little bit about why preview, I saw, I think, I wonder, listen, the standard that we've embedded in a rubric we call the AIR, Advocacy Inquiry Rubric, is important for teams and organizations and links back to my own personal motivation for what that's worth. Advocacy inquiry really matters, in my view, because it lets us know what are we discussing. It sets a standard for what becomes discussable. And it helps us know when other people's intentions are hidden or are explicit, and that has a big impact on psychological safety. So in my view, part of the engine of creating what Amy Edmondson called the fearless organization, by which she meant organizations where psychological safety is flourishing, is I know what's going on, I can speak up, I can ask for help. This environment is safe for interpersonal risk-taking because key motivations and goals are not occult, are not hidden. So advocacy inquiry or preview advocacy inquiry, listen, helps us build that community and that psychological safety. Clement Bouillon, Damien Shield, and I developed the AIR, the Advocacy Inquiry Rubric, so we could have kind of an airtight way of helping people achieve mastery of preview, I saw, I wonder, or advocacy inquiry. I think this is something that can help us generically, whether it's the AIR, whether it's delivering bad news type rubric like spikes, because rubrics help make excellence visible, learnable, and repeatable. And standards themselves help us put sunshine on what are the things that we care about most, what are the things that we're actually moving toward. And when we can name those hidden things, it tends to tame them and drain some of the hidden power from them in a way that is powerful. Paradoxically, when we know what we're moving toward, we can have that as a shared goal rather than a hidden unilateral mystery mastery move where I'm trying to get you to do something that you don't know what it is. So I'd like to wrap up by talking about the workout of the week with respect to standards. And that is, we'd like you to practice hearing, seeing, detecting, whether it's in a clinical interaction, whether it's in a meeting, an implicit standard and stating this: hey, it seems to me, or it's my perspective, that the standard we're moving toward here is X. Do you agree that that's a goal or a standard? You're naming it as your perspective and inviting the other person's input. Thank you for spending some of your time with me here in Curious Now. Would love to hear about your experience with detecting and naming explicit or implicit standards on your team or in your organization.